In the hollow ridge of Appalachia, 1901, there was a house at the edge of the forest that everyone in the valley knew to avoid. Its windows stared blankly across the hollow, and the air around it felt heavier than the rest of the mountains. Inside, a widow lived alone with her sons, and what unfolded within those walls would remain whispered about for generations. Her obsession with keeping her family intact, and in a way only she understood, consumed everything. No one outside that cabin truly knew what went on, but the stories that slipped through the cracks spoke of lives twisted and hearts broken, of a family caught in a grip they could not escape. Objects left behind, scratched furniture, scorched pages of a diary, the remnants of meals long spoiled, hinted at a life of control, fear, and something neither ordinary nor explainable. What drove a mother to bend her sons to her will in ways the world could barely comprehend? Could her influence, her choices, still echo across these ridges, carried by the wind through the trees? Before we go any further into Hollow Ridge and its secrets, I want to hear from you. Have you ever encountered, or even heard whispers of, strange events in Appalachia, or anywhere else with a history you couldn't explain? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and while you're there, make sure to like this video and subscribe. There are stories hidden in these mountains that few have dared to tell, and you won't want to miss the next one. The year was 1901. Appalachia was still a region carved by isolation, its mountains dense with forests and ridges so sharp they cut the sky in half. The people who lived here were hardy, accustomed to long winters and harsh summers, to days spent chopping wood, tending small gardens, and guiding livestock along paths worn into the earth. Life was simple, yes, but it was also a life that left little room for outsiders and little space for secrets. Hollow Ridge itself was tucked into a narrow valley, flanked by steep hills and thick pines. Fog would creep down from the upper ridges in the early morning, draping the land in a ghostly gray that made even the bravest traveler hesitate. It was into this quiet, remote hollow that the widow moved with her sons, a family mostly kept to themselves. To neighbors, she was stern and exacting, a woman who spoke little, but whose gaze could stop a man mid-step. To the boys, however, she was all-consuming, a force that shaped the very air in which they lived. The house was modest, built of timber planks and stone, but it carried the weight of long winters. Smoke curled from the chimney in thin streams, the hearth fire never fully extinguished. Inside, furniture bore the marks of careful hands, but also of obsession, every chair aligned, every shelf scrubbed. Meals were prepared with precision, and yet even in this order, there was an undercurrent of something unusual, something the neighbors sensed but could never name. Stories whispered among Hollow Ridge's few residents spoke of strange happenings, objects moving inexplicably, unexplained sounds in the night, and shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. Local folklore held that some hollows carried a memory, a residue of old grief or cruelty that clung to the soil and trees. Whether that was true or not, the widow and her sons were at the center of it all, their lives quietly unfolding in ways the outside world could not imagine. Every day, the boys followed routines dictated by their mother, their world confined to the hollow and the forest's edge. And yet, as orderly as the house seemed, the diary pages later recovered would reveal a story of control, manipulation, and despair that no neighbor could have guessed. A story that would not only shock the valley, but leave traces that lingered long after the hollow fell silent. The first signs that something was amiss in Hollow Ridge were subtle, almost imperceptible. To the casual observer, the widow's household seemed like any other in the valley, except for the way the boys never ventured beyond the edges of the forest, never spoke to outsiders, and never strayed from the strict routines their mother imposed. The neighbors noted it quietly, the children's eyes always downcast, their movements careful and measured, as if a single misstep could unleash some unseen consequence. Inside the cabin, the air carried a weight heavier than the smoke from the hearth. The walls, though plain and wooden, seemed to absorb sound, leaving the house unnervingly quiet. Every step echoed briefly, then faded into an unsettling stillness. Meals were prepared and consumed in silence, with the clink of spoons against bowls the only interruption. Yet the diary later found, its pages stained and warped by time, hinted at a reality far different from what any visitor could have guessed. Words written in tight, deliberate script described a mother consumed by her own designs, and sons whose childhoods were overwritten by control and compulsion. Neighbors began noticing things that did not align with the normal rhythm of mountain life. Late at night, faint lights flickered in the windows, even when the hearth fires had died down. Occasionally, muffled cries would drift across the hollow, soft enough that one could dismiss them, but persistent enough that the stories could not be ignored. Some of the more daring neighbors claimed to hear footsteps pacing in the cabin, though only one or two were ever supposed to be awake at the time. A quiet dread seemed to settle over the hollow, as if the house itself held its breath. The widow's methods were slow and deliberate. She controlled every aspect of her sons' lives, and as months passed, the boys began to mirror her obsession. The diary, torn and charred in places, hidden behind a loose board, revealed how she enforced routines that went beyond discipline. Each day had rules layered with punishment and expectation, and the boys learned quickly that deviation was not tolerated. The entries spoke of isolation, of a hunger for obedience that overshadowed any familial affection, and of the subtle ways a mother could bend her children's lives toward a goal only she understood. It was in the spring of 1901 that the valley's quiet fractured. A traveler passing along the ridge noticed the cabin door slightly ajar, though the widow was known to keep it tightly locked. Inside, objects were out of place, chairs overturned, a cradle overturned, and the faint smell of smoke where none should have been. Yet no one dared enter fully. When word reached the small community, curiosity wrestled with fear. The notion of entering the widow's home alone was unthinkable, and still the questions persisted. Had something terrible happened? Could the boys have run off? Or was the hollow itself responsible for what seemed impossible? Footsteps from within the forest hinted at movement, quick, light, deliberate. The wind carried soft murmurs across the trees. One neighbor, bold enough to approach the cabin during the afternoon, reported seeing shadows shifting across curtained windows, and a single object on the porch, a small, scorched book. No one knew its origin. It remained there for hours, unclaimed, a silent testament to something that had already occurred inside. By the time a group of villagers gathered later that evening, the house appeared unchanged, yet unmistakably altered. The air felt charged, heavy with the tension of events unseen. Inside, the hearth was cold, but the smell of burnt parchment lingered. Windows, which had previously reflected the clear mountains, now seemed dark, almost opaque. The door creaked when touched, as though warning intruders to stay away. And then, when one finally peered inside, they glimpsed a scene that would be whispered about for decades. A room marked by meticulous order. And yet in that order, signs of despair were impossible to miss. A torn blanket, a chair turned as if in haste, and the unmistakable feeling that someone, perhaps more than one someone, had suffered beyond comprehension. The villagers stepped back, hearts pounding, minds racing. They could not explain it. There were no footprints leading away from the house, no wagon tracks, no visible sign of struggle, and yet something had clearly occurred. Something that would not be undone or forgotten. What had been hidden behind the cabin walls? What had the widow forced her sons to endure? And why did the air itself seem to whisper, as if carrying the echoes of a family broken by its own matriarch? As darkness fell over Hollow Ridge that night, the forest seemed to close in tighter around the house. The faint flicker of a candle in the widow's window illuminated the outline of a solitary figure inside. And for those who watched from afar, it was impossible to tell who it was or what they were doing. Questions mounted. Fear hung in the air like the dense fog creeping along the ridges. And for the villagers who had seen the cabin that day, one thought lingered above all others. Whatever had happened in Hollow Ridge, it was far from over. But when the searchers finally mustered the courage to enter the cabin fully, the sight that met their eyes would leave even the hardiest among them speechless. What they found inside, no one could have anticipated. By the time the first searchers reached Hollow Ridge, the sun had long begun its descent behind the jagged peaks. The forest, which during the day had seemed serene, now took on a presence that weighed on every step. Each footfall on the moss-covered path was muted, absorbed by the damp earth. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching out toward the travelers, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to observe. The villagers had gathered reluctantly. Some came with lanterns swinging gently from their hands. Others simply followed the flickers of candlelight from their homes. A few, braver, or perhaps more desperate, carried crude implements, axes, knives, and sticks sharpened to points. None spoke aloud, but their expressions betrayed the collective unease. Even in the daylight, Hollow Ridge had always carried an air of quiet isolation. Now, at twilight, that isolation seemed suffocating. As they approached the cabin, the first signs of the widow's influence became apparent. The door, once slightly ajar, was now shut, yet it showed no marks of force. The lock, simple though it was, had been turned in a way that suggested careful thought. A small pile of ash sat near the hearth, as if someone had burned fragments of paper or wood, though no smoke lingered in the air. A nearby table held objects meticulously arranged, their purpose unclear. A cracked cup, a lone spoon, and a bundle of what appeared to be torn clothing. Every detail suggested intent, careful, precise, and yet haunting. The searchers began to spread out, moving from room to room. The walls seemed to absorb their movements, and with each step came a new, unsettling detail. On the floor of the main room, they discovered footprints, small and light, as if belonging to children, but their direction was inconsistent. Some led toward the back of the cabin, others toward the fireplace, as though the occupants had walked in circles, unsure or hesitant, trapped by an invisible force. It was here that the diary first revealed its presence. Tucked behind a loose plank in the corner, its pages were yellowed and warped by time and smoke. The handwriting, cramped and precise, told of rules that bound the boys to their mother's will, describing the hours, the expectations, and the punishments in chilling detail. But even more disturbing were the entries that hinted at subtle rituals, behaviors imposed to ensure absolute compliance, as though the mother's authority extended beyond reason or morality. Outside, the The forest seemed alive. A faint rustle, a snapped twig, and shadows moving just beyond the lantern light kept the searchers on edge. Some of the older villagers swore they heard whispers in the trees, soft and indecipherable. And for a moment, they questioned their own senses. Could the hollow itself be speaking? Or was it only their imagination, drawn taut by the tension of what they were about to uncover? Midway through the search, a new discovery added a layer of complexity. Beneath the floorboards in the boys' bedroom, a loose section revealed a small hidden compartment. Inside were objects carefully concealed: a set of crude carvings on wood, small trinkets, and another diary. This one was more fragmented, but it hinted at the boys' own experiences, frightened, compliant, and yet documenting moments of confusion, fear, and longing for freedom. The compartment suggested both secrecy and desperation, a hidden narrative that had gone unnoticed by the outside world until now. As the villagers compared their findings, tensions rose. The details did not align neatly. One diary described strict routines imposed by the mother, while fragments in the hidden compartment suggested the boys had occasionally resisted or questioned her authority. Torn fabrics on the floor seemed to match the descriptions of punishment, yet no one could locate the instruments mentioned. Footprints led to walls, then stopped abruptly, as though those who had walked them had vanished into the air itself. And then there was the matter of the symbols. Carved faintly into the trees surrounding the cabin were shapes that none of the villagers recognized. Circles, lines, and intersecting angles that did not resemble any alphabet or numeral. Some thought they might be marks of superstition, reminders to follow the rules, or even warnings. Others could not explain them, feeling that the symbols carried a weight they could not name, a sense that the forest itself was marking the area, perhaps memorializing events no one wanted to recount. The search continued late into the night, but the hollow resisted clarity. Every discovery raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of violent struggle, no tracks leading beyond the hollow, and yet the feeling of disturbance was undeniable. Those who had entered the cabin felt it. The air thick with restraint, with history, with something left undone. Some returned home with eyes wide and voices low, recounting stories that would later become the foundation for local legend. At the heart of it all remained the mother's influence, a force so thorough that even after the cabin had been entered, the boys' experiences remained partially obscured. The diaries spoke, the symbols hinted, the footprints confused, but the truth of what had occurred within Hollow Ridge was not fully accessible. And for those searching, the forest seemed to whisper an implicit warning. Tread carefully, for every answer uncovered would inevitably lead to another question, darker and more unsettling than the last. Did you notice the symbol carved into the tree, described earlier? What could it mean, and why would it be placed here? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to explore more hidden stories from Appalachia's past. But the mysteries of Hollow Ridge did not end with the cabin. Even as the villagers left the house that night, the forest seemed to stir, and later, strange reports would emerge, glowing lights, objects moving on their own, and sounds that no one could trace. What happened next would change everything, and no one could explain it. Even after the searchers left Hollow Ridge, the hollow itself did not settle. The forest, which had seemed merely silent before, began to hum with a quiet awareness. Nights carried sounds that could not be explained. Footsteps in the underbrush when no one was walking. The faint clatter of objects shifting within the cabin, even though it had been carefully secured. Locals whispered that the house and its surroundings had a memory, a residue of the lives that had been shaped and bent inside its walls. It started with small occurrences. A villager passing the hollow at dusk reported a light flickering in a second-floor window, though the widow had long since disappeared from sight. Others claimed to hear faint murmurs, conversations too quiet to distinguish, echoing as if the trees themselves were carrying the sound. One hunter swore he had glimpsed shadows moving along the ridges, glimpses of figures that paused, then vanished when approached. These reports became more unsettling over the weeks. Some neighbors described lanterns bobbing along the forest edge, appearing and disappearing, as though someone, or something, was tracing the paths once walked by the widow and her sons. Doors, previously secured, were later found slightly ajar, though no human presence could be detected. Objects inside the cabin moved inexplicably. A chair shifted from one side of the room to another. A bundle of clothing was no longer where it had been left, and scattered diary pages reappeared in locations far from their original hiding spots. The diaries, previously recovered, offered further unsettling insight. Entries hinted at strange practices, rituals designed not only to enforce obedience, but to impose patterns of behavior that might bind the family in ways beyond natural understanding. Though some scholars later debated whether these were purely psychological manipulations or hints at folklore-inspired rituals, the effect on the boys was clear. Their lives were tightly controlled, and their movements, thoughts, and even their perceptions of the world had been shaped inside the cabin. As the weeks turned into months, rumors spread beyond the immediate hollow. Travelers passing through Appalachia recounted tales of faint cries carried on the wind, of lights that danced along ridges long after sunset, and of fleeting glimpses of children who appeared in the distance before vanishing behind trees. Some historians suggest these accounts were the product of a community grappling with trauma and the unknown, while others claim the hollow itself retained a memory of those who had suffered there, echoing outward in the form of lights, sounds, and sensations. Amid the folklore, a particularly disturbing discovery was made. A nearby stream, once clear and calm, had branches and twigs arranged along its banks in precise geometric patterns. Locals who investigated suggested that the widow had used the stream to mark boundaries, perhaps to reinforce her authority or ritualize the boys' movements. The carvings in surrounding trees, once dismissed as childish marks, now appeared to align with the stream, forming an intricate map of control that extended beyond the cabin's walls. Even the community's attempts to document these phenomena could not capture their full effect. Sketches of the symbols, photographs of the cabin, and written reports could only hint at the uncanny nature of the hollow. Many who attempted to study or record the events left Hollow Ridge feeling unsettled, reporting that time itself seemed distorted. Minutes stretched, footsteps echoed unnaturally, and the forest appeared to shift slightly with each glance, as if resisting observation. Amid this growing unease, secondary witnesses began to recount experiences that defied conventional explanation. Children passing near the hollow spoke of feeling watched, as though unseen eyes followed them through the forest. Farmers reported tools and livestock mysteriously moved overnight, sometimes left in patterns that mimicked the carvings found near the cabin, and there were accounts of sudden chills, gusts of wind, and faint whispers in the Appalachian dialects, drifting from places where no one stood. The combination of folklore, historical fact, and strange phenomena began to merge into a narrative that was at once terrifying and compelling. The widow's control over her sons, once an isolated tragedy, seemed to have left an imprint that extended far beyond the cabin walls. The hollow, the trees, the stream, and the remnants of her household appeared to carry fragments of her obsession, her meticulousness, and her cruelty, like echoes suspended in the Appalachian mist. What happened next would change everything. Records, testimonies, and physical evidence all suggested that Hollow Ridge had become a locus of forces no one could fully comprehend. And though the family itself had vanished into the annals of history, their story was far from finished, leaving questions that historians, folklorists, and locals still struggle to answer today. Have you ever experienced or heard of places that seem to carry memories of the past, where objects, sounds, or even the wind seemed aware of those who lived there? Comment below with your story, and make sure to like and subscribe to uncover more hidden chapters from the Appalachian Mountains. As the years passed, Hollow Ridge slowly returned to the quiet isolation that had defined it before the widow's arrival. The mountains remained steadfast and unchanged, yet the hollow retained a weight that could not be measured. Scholars, historians, and folklorists who later visited the area were struck by the layers of mystery that clung to the land. Some came seeking answers, others to document the folklore that had grown around a family, destroyed by obsession and fear. Historical records provide only fragments of the truth. County documents list the widow and her sons, noting their presence and minor transactions, but nothing prepared future generations for the disturbing accounts whispered in the valleys. Diaries discovered decades later revealed her meticulous control over the household and the psychological toll on her sons, but the full extent of what happened within those walls may never be known. Some passages hint at acts so calculated and prolonged that they defy conventional understanding, while others reflect the boy's attempts to reclaim autonomy in a home where freedom was forbidden. Folklorists studying Appalachia often point to Hollow Ridge as an example of a place where family, history, and the landscape converge to create a story that is part reality, part legend. The symbols carved into trees, the patterns along the stream, and the unexplained movements of objects all feed into a narrative that blurs the line between the physical and the psychological, between what happened and what was perceived. Even skeptics acknowledge the consistency of local reports: lanterns moving without explanation, whispers in the trees, shadows that seem to watch from the ridge. Experts have speculated on several possibilities. Psychologists suggest the boy's upbringing could have created a lasting imprint on the hollow itself, the way trauma can shape perception and memory. Historians consider the isolation of Appalachian life in 1901, where communities were tightly knit yet entirely self-contained, as fertile ground for unchecked control and cruelty. Folklorists point to Appalachian beliefs in the memory of places, where the natural environment retains traces of intense emotion or tragedy. Whatever the explanation, the consensus remains elusive. And yet, for all the academic theories, there is one undeniable fact. Hollow Ridge left an imprint that cannot be ignored. The house may have decayed, the widow long gone, and the sons disappeared into history, but reports persisted. Lanterns flickering in fog, objects moving in the empty cabin, whispers among the trees. Even today, hikers and locals tell stories of hearing soft cries echoing through the hollow, and of glimpsing figures that vanish when approached. The story of the Hollow Ridge widow and her sons may never be fully understood. Some chapters are preserved in diary pages, some in folklore, and some in the lingering presence of a hollow that has seen more than it should. Was it purely human obsession that shaped the events, or did the hollow itself play a role in the persistence of these mysteries? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between history and the whispers of the mountains themselves. What do you think really happened in Hollow Ridge? Could the Hollow still be holding onto its secrets, waiting for the next witness to uncover what was left behind? Comment your theory below, and if you dare, share your own experiences with places that carry the weight of the past. And this is only one of the many forgotten horrors of the Appalachian Mountains. Our next story will explore another family, another hollow, and another secret that time tried to bury, but could never erase. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The mountains have more to tell, and you'll want to hear it all.